There are killers who hide in the shadows. There are killers who stalk in the dark. And then there are killers who smile at you in broad daylight and make you feel like you are the safest person in the room. Michael Bruce Ross was that kind of killer. He walked among ordinary people in ordinary places, and not a single one of them saw what was coming. He was educated. He was articulate. He held doors open for strangers. And behind all of that, he carried something that most of us cannot even begin to understand. A hunger, a compulsion, a need to destroy that had been building inside him since he was barely old enough to understand what death even was. By the time the state of Connecticut strapped him down and ended his life in 2005, he had already taken 8 young women from this world. 8 lives, 8 families shattered, on 8 graves that should never have existed. And here is what makes this case so deeply unsettling. For years, nobody saw him for what he truly was. Not his teachers, not his university, not even the police who arrested him once and let him walk right back out into the world to kill again. But here's what I want you to pay attention to as we go through this story together. There is a moment later in this video, a moment inside an interrogation room where a criminologist does something extraordinary, something that most people would never think to do. He sits across from Michael Bruce Ross, and he does not try to break him. He does not threaten him. He does not pressure him. Instead, he humiliates him. And in doing so, he gets Ross to confess to murders that police could never have pinned on him otherwise. I want you to stay with me until we get there, because the way that interrogation plays out is one of the most fascinating things I have ever come across in all of my research into cases like this. This is the story of Michael Bruce Ross, the roadside strangler. And I promise you, by the time we get to the end of this, you are going to sit there and wonder how on earth this man was allowed to do what he did for as long as he did it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. So let us start at the very beginning, because that is where the answers are. That is where the warning signs were. And that is where we first see the kind of childhood that can break something inside a person in ways that never fully heal. Michael Bruce Ross grew up on an egg farm in rural Connecticut. And on the surface, that sounds almost peaceful, does it not? Rolling fields, fresh air, a quiet life far removed from the chaos of city living. But there was nothing peaceful about that household. Not for Michael. His mother was a deeply troubled woman, erratic, violent, unpredictable. She would later be admitted to a psychiatric facility, but by that point she had already spent years inflicting the kind of damage on her eldest child that leaves marks no doctor can see. Ross was the oldest of 4 children, and he bore the brunt of her rages. He was beaten. He was screamed at. He was made to feel like he was worthless. And if that was not enough to fracture the foundation of a young mind, his uncle sexually abused him as well. So picture that for a moment. A boy growing up in a home where the person who is supposed to love him the most is the person he fears the most, where safety does not exist, where trust is something that gets rewarded with pain. That is the environment that shaped Michael Bruce Ross. That is the soil in which everything that came after was planted. Now, here is the thing that a lot of people struggle with when they look at cases like this. They want to find one single moment, one event, one breaking point that turned an ordinary person into a killer. But it does not work that way. Not really. The criminologists who have studied Ross and men like him will tell you the same thing. It is not one moment. It is an accumulation. A slow and steady erosion of something inside them. And for Ross, that erosion started very early. When he was just 10 years old, one of his responsibilities on that farm was to deal with the chickens that were too sick or too deformed to be kept. He strangled them, a 10-year-old boy wringing the necks of birds with his bare hands. And at the time, nobody thought twice about it. It was farm life. It was practical. It was something that needed to be done. But looking back now, with everything we know about what that boy would grow up to become, that detail sits very differently, doesn't it? Because that was not just a chore. That was practice. Whether anyone understood it at the time or not, that was a young mind learning what it felt like to take a life. Learning what it felt like to hold something helpless in your hands and watch the light leave it. Despite everything happening behind closed doors at home, Ross was a sharp student, genuinely intelligent. His grades were strong enough to earn him a place at Cornell University, which is no small thing. Cornell is one of the most prestigious institutions in this country, and Ross walked through those doors looking for all the world like a young man with a bright future ahead of him. He was approachable. He could hold a conversation. He made acquaintances without too much difficulty. But there was always something slightly off, something that sat just beneath the surface. The people who knew him later described it as an awkwardness, a lack of genuine warmth, like he was performing normalcy rather than actually feeling it. And that is a pattern we see again and again in individuals like Ross. They learn to mimic the behavior they see around them. They learn to say the right things, to smile at the right moments, but underneath all of that there is an emptiness, a void where empathy should be. And Ross filled that void with something far darker. The thing about someone like Ross is that he understood people on a surface level. He could read a room. He could tell you what someone wanted to hear. He was charming in the way that a well-rehearsed actor is charming. But the moment anyone tried to get close to him, the moment a relationship required something real, something vulnerable, something honest, Ross could not deliver it. He did not have it to give. And so what happened instead was the anger, the frustration, the feeling of being disconnected from the very thing everyone around him seemed to have so effortlessly. That feeling does not disappear. It festers. And for Ross, it festered into something monstrous. By the time he was in his early 20s, Ross had already begun to act on the urges that had been building inside him for years. And this is where the experts come in. Because understanding how someone moves from disturbed childhood to convicted serial killer is not something most of us are equipped to do on our own. The professionals who have studied these cases will tell you it is never a leap. It is a staircase. And each step feels manageable. Each step feels like it is only slightly further than the last. It starts with voyeurism, stalking, following someone, watching them through a window, convincing yourself that what you are doing is not that serious, not really hurting anyone. Then it escalates, a sexual assault. And if you get away with it, if no one comes knocking on your door the next morning, then you learn something dangerous. You learn that you can do this. And the next time the urge comes, it is stronger, more urgent, more impossible to ignore. And eventually, for some of them, it reaches a point where the only way to silence what is screaming inside their head is to kill. That is where Ross ended up. Not overnight, not in a single moment of madness, but through a long, slow descent that nobody around him ever fully recognized for what it was. Ross graduated from Cornell, where he had studied economics, and almost immediately his criminal behavior began to surface in ways that should have raised serious alarms. He was convicted of assaulting a teenage girl, a 16-year-old. He had dragged her into the woods. The only reason she survived is because police happened to intervene. He received a fine, a 2-year probation, and then he was released back into the world. Think about that for a moment. A man who had just kidnapped and assaulted a teenager, given a slap on the wrist and sent on his way, because at that point the system had no way of knowing what he had already done. And it certainly had no way of knowing what he was about to do. But there is another layer to Ross that makes him particularly dangerous. And this is something the experts who studied him found deeply troubling. Ross did not attack randomly. Not really. He had a trigger. Every single time he escalated. Every single time he moved from one victim to the next, there was a personal event that preceded it. A relationship that ended badly. A rejection. A moment where he felt dismissed or disrespected by a woman. And in those moments, something inside him snapped. Not with rage exactly, with something colder than rage. A decision, a deliberate choice to transfer all of that pain onto someone else. Someone who had nothing to do with whatever had upset him. It did not matter who she was. It did not matter where she was. What mattered was that she was there, and she was vulnerable, and he could take what he needed from her. Ross himself admitted this later. He said he never saw his victims as people. Not really, they were outlets, targets, objects he could project his anger onto and then discard. If you asked him to pick one of his victims out of a lineup immediately after a murder, he said he could not have done it. He did not register their faces, their names, their existence. They were already gone from his mind the moment it was over. That level of detachment, that complete absence of human connection, that is what made Michael Bruce Ross so extraordinarily dangerous. And that is what made him so extraordinarily difficult to catch. Now we need to talk about Jung Natu, because she was the very first person Michael Bruce Ross killed, but she would not be connected to him for years. Natu was 25 years old, a fellow student at Cornell. She was described by everyone who knew her as bright, funny, full of life, the kind of person who walked into a room and made it better just by being there. And in May of 1981, she and Ross had been in the same evening class on campus. And shortly after that, her body was found at the bottom of a gorge near a creek close to the fraternity house where Ross lived. Police looked at the scene, and they saw a young woman at the bottom of a ravine, and their first instinct was suicide, that she had jumped or fallen, but her family refused to accept that. They knew her. They knew who she was, and a person like Jung Natu did not throw herself off a cliff. Subsequent examinations revealed injuries that were not consistent with someone who had simply leapt to her death. But there was no physical evidence tying Ross to the crime. Not at that point. So the case went cold, and Natu's family was left not just grieving but searching, desperate to understand what had actually happened to their daughter. It would be years before they got their answer, and when they did, it would destroy them all over again. But Ross was not done, not even close. In January of 1982, he killed again. 17-year-old Tammy Williams lived just a mile from the Ross family farm. She knew the area. She knew the roads. And none of that mattered. She was raped and murdered, and her body was not discovered for over 2 years. 2 years. Her parents spent that entire time not knowing where their daughter was, not knowing what had happened to her, just waiting and hoping and slowly losing hope. That is the kind of cruelty that extends far beyond the act itself. It is not just what Ross did to his victims, it is what he did to the people who loved them. Less than 2 months after Tammy Williams disappeared, Paula Pereira went missing. She was 16, when a high school student. Paula had a habit of hitchhiking. It was something she did regularly to get around, and her friends had warned her about it more than once. But on this particular day, she needed to get to a vocational cooking class, and hitching a ride seemed like the easiest option. She never made it to that class. Her body was found by the roadside in Wallkill, north of New York City, 2 weeks after she vanished. Ross had picked her up, and Paula Pereira's life ended in the back of his car. It is one of the details in this case that stays with you, because it was so ordinary, a teenager catching a ride, something millions of young people do every single day, and it cost her everything. June of 1982, Deborah Smith Taylor disappeared after a fight with her husband. Their car had broken down, and rather than stay together and look for help, they split up and went in opposite directions to find a gas station. It was a simple decision, the kind of decision any couple might make in that situation. But it was a decision that put Deborah Smith Taylor alone on a road where Michael Bruce Ross was waiting. She became his fourth victim, and once again, nobody saw it coming. By this point, Ross had developed a pattern, not just in how he selected his victims, but in how he controlled them. The details that emerged later from his own confession are extraordinarily disturbing. He would approach these women, threaten them, and then in a calculated and deliberate way, he would attempt to calm them down, to make them believe that if they just cooperated, things would not be as bad as they feared. He would tell them he was going to tie them up and walk away, that if they just stayed still and stayed quiet, he would leave them. And they believed him, because what other choice did they have? So they would lie face down on the ground. And the moment they did, Ross would come up behind them. And that was the last thing they ever experienced. It is the kind of detail that is difficult to sit with, because it reveals something about the mind of a killer that goes beyond simple violence. It reveals a mind that enjoyed the manipulation as much as the act itself, the power, the control, the ability to decide someone else's fate. Robin Stavinsky was 19 years old, a track and field athlete, strong, muscular, the kind of young woman who could fight back, and she did fight back. But Ross overpowered her. He raped her. He murdered her. She went missing in November of 1983, and when her body was eventually found, her mother Joan had to go to the morgue and identify her daughter on Thanksgiving Day. Some pain does not have words that are adequate to describe it, and Joan Stavinsky lived with that pain for the rest of her life. But nothing Ross had done up to that point would compare to what happened next, Because in April of 1984, he did not just kill one person, he killed two, and they were children. April Brune and Leslie Shelley were 14 years old. They were best friends, closest sisters. They had just been to the movies together and they were hitchhiking home. A normal evening, two teenage girls doing what teenage girls do. Ross offered them a ride, and instead of taking them home, he drove them to a deserted stretch of road near Preston. See, what happened next is almost impossible to describe without feeling something break inside you. Ross forced Leslie Shelley into the trunk of his car so she could not escape. Then he turned his attention to April Brune. April fought. She fought desperately. She had a small knife and she tried to defend herself while her best friend Leslie called out to her from the trunk. Words of comfort, words of encouragement. April Brune was 14 years old and she was trying to stay alive while her friends shouted through the back of a car trying to keep her going. And it was not enough. April was raped and strangled to death. And then Ross went back to the car, and he killed Leslie Shelley too. He later said he had considered Leslie brave, so he decided not to rape her. He strangled her instead. Acted because he wanted to avoid the possibility of her identifying him later. That was his reasoning. That was how he thought about it. 14-year-old girls, and he was weighing the practical implications of his own crimes as if they were business decisions. Ross himself later said something that reveals everything you need to know about the kind of person he was. He said that of all his victims, the only one that ever played on his mind was the youngest, the 14-year-old. But not because of guilt, not because of remorse. It simply bothered him. Like an itch he could not quite reach. The rest of them, nothing. They left no mark on him whatsoever. He took their lives and felt nothing. And this is where I need you to pay close attention. Because what comes next in this story is the part that separates this case from most serial killer investigations you have ever watched or read about. This is where the system finally fought back. And it did not fight back with force. It fought back with something much smarter than force. It fought back with psychology. Wendy Barabal was 17. She was Ross's final victim. In June of 1984, she left a note for her parents telling them she was walking to a local shop. She never came back. Her body was found under a pile of rocks on the side of a road in Griswold, Connecticut. And this time the investigation moved differently. A tip came in from someone who had seen a man sitting in a blue Toyota near the area where Wendy had been found. Ross owned a blue Toyota, and his family home was in the same general vicinity as the murders. Police visited him, and the game was over. Or rather, it was about to become something else entirely. Because what followed Ross's arrest was not just a confession, it was a masterclass in how to get inside the head of a killer and how to use their own ego against them. This is where criminologist Christopher Berry enters the story. Berry was brought in to interrogate Ross, and what he describes about that experience is unlike anything you will hear in most criminal investigations. Berry understood something fundamental about men like Ross. Men like these killers, they crave recognition. They want to be seen. They want someone to understand what they did and to be impressed by it. So Berry made a decision. He sat down across from Michael Bruce Ross and he was calm, completely calm, no fear, no visible emotion of any kind. Because Berry knew that the moment a killer sees weakness in the person sitting across from them, they will shut down. They will play games. They will feed you nothing. But if you show them strength, if you show them that you are not afraid, that you are the one in control of the room, they will talk. They will talk and talk and talk because they cannot help themselves. And Ross did talk. He sat there and he began to boast. He described his murders in detail, how long it took, what it felt like. He reveled in it. He wanted Berry to hear every word, so Berry let him talk. And then at a precise and calculated moment, Berry leaned forward and said something that stopped Ross cold. He told him he was not a big hitter, that 6 or 7 murders in his mind was nothing, that he was not Ted Bundy, not Kenneth Bianchi, that he was small fry, a little guy. And Ross looked stunned because no one had ever spoken to him that way. No one had ever diminished what he had done. And in that moment of wounded pride, Ross did exactly what Berry wanted him to do. He pushed back. He insisted he had done more. He started revealing victims that had not yet been linked to him. Jung Natu, Paula Pereira, names that police had not been able to connect to Ross through evidence alone. Barry pressed him further. He asked Ross about Jung Natu specifically, and Ross told him. He described how he had disposed of her body, the location, the details, things only the killer would know. Then Barry moved to Paula Pereira. He asked Ross what he did with the body, and Ross told him that too. He described where he left her, what she was wearing, and then he said something that Barry would never forget. He said he treated her body like trash, like garbage. He had used her. He had abused her. And then he had walked away without a second thought. And Barry sat there and did not flinch, did not react, did not give Ross the satisfaction of seeing any emotion on his face whatsoever, because that was the whole point. Ross needed to believe he was in control. He needed to believe he was the one running the show, and Barry let him believe that. Right up until the moment Ross realized he had just handed over everything. Every secret, every confession, every piece of evidence that Barry had been waiting for. By the time Ross understood what had happened, it was far too late. Barry walked out of that room with confessions that police had been searching for. Confessions that solved cold cases. Confessions that gave families answers they had been desperately seeking for years. It was not the most dramatic arrest in the history of criminal investigation, but it was arguably the most effective interrogation. Because Barry did not break Michael Ross. He simply let Ross break himself, and he did it without ever raising his voice. Armed with those confessions, police went back and charged Ross with 2 additional homicides. The full scope of what he had done was finally laid bare, and the weight of it was staggering. 8 women, 8 murders, 7 of them sexually assaulted, a killing spree that had stretched across years and states and left a trail of devastated families in its wake. In July of 1987, Ross was sentenced to death. 6 separate death sentences handed down for the murders of Wendy Barabel, Robin Stavinsky, Leslie Shelley, and April Brune, among others. For a time, it seemed like justice had been served, but the legal system in this country is complicated and slow. And in July of 1994, those death sentences were overturned. A procedural error. The judge had incorrectly excluded a letter from a psychiatric evaluation. It was a technicality. But in the eyes of the law, it was enough to throw the entire case back into question. And so the families of the victims were forced to go through it all again, to relive what had been done to their daughters, their friends, their sisters, to sit in a courtroom and listen to the details of crimes that had already destroyed them once. For years after that, Ross fought his sentences. He claimed to have found God while in prison. He worked as a Bible translator. He presented himself as a changed man. A reformed man. Some people believed him. A woman named Susan Powers even became engaged to him while he was on death row. She spent time with him. She visited him. She believed he had genuinely changed, but she called it off 2 years before he was executed. Whether she saw through him in the end or simply could not live with the reality of who he was, nobody knows for certain. What we do know is that Ross never once expressed genuine remorse for what he had done. Not in any way that the families of his victims found meaningful. He spoke about God. He spoke about redemption. But he never once looked at those families and acknowledged the full weight of what he had taken from them. And that too is part of the legacy of Michael Bruce Ross. On May 13, 2005, Michael Bruce Ross was taken to the execution chamber at Osborne Correctional Institution in Somers, Connecticut. A lethal injection was administered. Members of the families of some of his victims were present to watch. And after decades of pain and grief and unanswered questions, the roadside strangler was dead. But here is what stays with you long after you walk away from a case like this. It is not the violence. As horrifying as it is, the violence is almost secondary. What stays with you is the system. The way Ross slipped through every crack that existed. A boy who was beaten and abused and no one intervened. A young man who assaulted a teenager and received probation. A killer who walked among university students and neighbors and shopkeepers, and not one of them suspected a thing. And then the confession. The way Ross sat in front of Barry and talked about his victims like they were nothing. Like they were inconveniences. Like they were objects he had used and thrown away. That is what stays with you, because it tells you something uncomfortable about how ordinary evil can look when it decides to hide. There is also the question that haunts every single one of these cases. The what if. What if someone at Cornell had looked a little closer at the awkward young man who could not quite connect with people the way everyone else did? What if the judge who sentenced Ross to probation after the assault had understood the full picture of who he was dealing with? What if a neighbor on that Connecticut farm had noticed the signs and said something? Any one of those moments could have changed everything, could have saved 8 lives. And the fact that none of them did is not just a failure of individuals. It is a failure of a system that was never designed to catch someone like Ross, someone who looked and sounded and behaved exactly like everyone else until the moment he did not. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this case, and it is a truth that applies far beyond Michael Bruce Ross. It applies to anyone who has ever looked at a case like this and thought that would never happen in my neighborhood. It happens everywhere. It has always happened everywhere. And the people who do it are almost never the monsters we imagine them to be. They are the people we smile at on the street, the people we sit next to in class, the people who hold the door open for us when our hands are full. And the scariest part of all of that is that most of the time we would never know the difference. That is what Michael Bruce Ross proved, and that is a lesson none of us can afford to forget. 8 young women never came home. Jung Natu, Tammy Williams, Paula Pereira, Deborah Smith-Taylor, Robin Stavinsky, April Brune, Leslie Shelley, Wendy Barabal. Their names deserve to be spoken. Their stories deserve to be heard. Not because of the man who took them, but because of who they were. They were daughters, they were friends, they were students, they were athletes, they were people who laughed and dreamed and had every reason to believe the future was theirs. And Michael Bruce Ross took all of that away. Every single possibility, every single moment they would never get to live, every graduation they would never attend, every holiday their families would spend with an empty chair at the table. He took it with no remorse and no guilt and no understanding of what he had done to the people left behind. And that is the truth of what makes a case like this so hard to walk away from. It is not just one man's evil. It is the weight of 8 lives and every single person who loved them. And that weight does not go away. Not really, not ever. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.